I sat at the dinner table, staring at the financial aid forms spread out in front of me. My hands were shaking a little as I pushed them toward my parents. All they had to do was sign, just a signature, and I could start community college in the fall. My father looked at the papers like they were trash. My mother glanced at my older brother, Marcus, and smiled. Then she said the words that changed everything: "We've decided to invest in Marcus's landscaping business instead. He has real potential." My brother smirked at me from across the table. I felt my chest tighten. I asked if they were serious. My father leaned back in his chair and said, "You're aiming too high, son. College isn't for everyone." I stood up so fast my chair scraped the floor. I didn't say anything. I just walked toward the door. My shoes were still by the entrance, but I didn't stop to put them on. I drove off barefoot, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. 2 hours later, my car started making a terrible noise, then it died completely on the side of the highway. That's when I remembered, they had removed me from their insurance that same afternoon. I managed to get the car to a gas station parking lot before it gave up completely. I sat there for hours, trying to figure out what to do. I had $43 in my wallet and nowhere to go. Around midnight, I drove back home, praying they'd at least let me sleep the one more night. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw my suitcase sitting on the front porch. My mother opened the door before I even knocked. She handed me a garbage bag with the rest of my clothes inside. Her voice was cold when she said, "This house is for people who make smart choices." I asked her if she was really doing this. She just closed the door. I stood there for a minute, staring at the bag in my hands. Then I loaded everything into my car and left. I had no plan, no money, and no idea where I was going. The engine rattled the entire way. I drove until I found a quiet street and parked under a broken streetlight. I reclined the seat as far as it would go and tried to sleep. But all I could hear was my mother's voice saying I wasn't smart enough. The next morning, I woke up to someone tapping on my window. I panicked at first, thinking it was the police. But it was an older woman in scrubs, holding a coffee cup. She asked if I was okay. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. She didn't believe me. She asked if my car was broken, and I admitted it was. Then she asked if I had a place to stay. I shook my head. She looked at me for a long moment, then said, "Follow me to the diner down the street. I'll buy you breakfast." Her name was Carolyn, and she was a nurse at the regional hospital. Over eggs and toast, I told her everything, my family, the forms, the suitcase. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "I have a spare room, you can stay there for a bit while you figure things out." I almost cried. By the end of the week, she had helped me get a janitorial position at her hospital. It wasn't much, but it was something. I started the following Monday. The hospital was huge and overwhelming at first. I spent my days mopping floors, emptying trash bins, and delivering meal trays to patient rooms. I watched doctors move quickly through the halls, nurses checking charts, and families waiting nervously in lobbies. There was a rhythm to it all, and I found it oddly comforting. During my lunch breaks, I would sit in the back stairwell and read. I had picked up a used anatomy textbook from a thrift store for $2. One afternoon, a doctor walked past me on the stairs and stopped. He looked at the book in my hands, then at me. "Where did you get that?" he asked. I told him I bought it. He asked why a janitor was reading medical textbooks. I didn't have a good answer, so I just said I was curious. He nodded slowly, then told me to follow him to his office. My heart pounded the whole way there. I thought I was in trouble, but when we got to his office, he didn't yell. He just asked me questions, about the book, about what I wanted to do with my life, about why I was working here. I told him the truth. Dr. Harrison didn't look at me with pity. He looked at me like I mattered. He asked if I had ever thought about going to college. I told him I had tried, but my family wouldn't help. He leaned back in his chair and said, What if I wrote you a recommendation letter? Would you apply for scholarships? I felt hope flicker in my chest for the first time in weeks. I said yes. Over the next month, Harrison helped me apply to 3 different scholarship programs. I filled out applications during my breaks and submitted essays late at night in Caroline's spare room. 2 months later, I got an acceptance letter. I had been awarded a full scholarship to a nearby community college. I couldn't believe it. I called home to tell my mother the news, thinking maybe she'd be proud. She answered on the 3rd ring. I said, "Mom, I got into college. Full scholarship." There was a long pause. Then she said, "Good luck with that," and hung up. I stared at my phone for a while. Then I deleted her number. College was harder than I expected. I worked nights at the hospital and attended classes during the day. I barely slept. Some weeks, I lived on vending machine snacks and coffee. I failed my first biology exam and had to retake it. I wanted to quit so many times, but every time I thought about giving up, I remembered my mother's voice saying I wasn't smart enough. That kept me going. Caroline checked on me often. She would leave me notes on the kitchen counter with encouraging words. One night, I came home from a late shift and found her sitting at the table, looking pale. She told me she had been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. I felt the ground fall out from under me. She passed away 3 months later. The night before she died, she handed me a folded piece of paper. It said, "Become the man they said you'd never be." I kept that note in my wallet. A year later, I finished my prerequisites and applied to medical school. Against all odds, I got in. Medical school was brutal. The workload was overwhelming, and the pressure was constant. But I refused to quit. I studied until my eyes burned, practiced procedures until my hands stopped shaking, and pushed through every doubt. During my 3rd year, I decided to visit home. I hadn't seen my family in almost 5 years. I thought maybe enough time had passed. When I pulled up to the house, nothing had changed. My mother opened the door and looked at me like I was a stranger. She didn't hug me. She just said, "What do you want?" I told her I was in medical school. She raised an eyebrow and said, "Medical school? You?" My brother walked into the room, looking tired and older than I remembered. His landscaping business had failed 2 years earlier, and he was living back at home. He didn't even acknowledge me. My father sat in his recliner, barely looking up from the TV. When I mentioned I was doing well, my mother smirked and said, "We'll see how long that lasts." I stayed for less than an hour. Then I left and promised myself I'd never let them define me again. I graduated from medical school in the top 15% of my class. It felt surreal to walk across that stage and receive my diploma. I had no family there to celebrate with me, but I didn't need them. I started my residency at the same hospital where I used to mop floors. Some of the older nurses still remembered me. They congratulated me, and a few of them cried. I worked hard, earned respect, and eventually moved into hospital administration. I loved the blend of medicine and leadership. One afternoon, the hospital's board of directors approached me about applying for a major leadership position. The current director was retiring, and they believed I was the right person to take over. I didn't think I had a chance, but I applied anyway. 3 months later, I was offered the position. I became the director of the hospital at 34 years old. I kept the news private, no social media posts, no announcements to anyone outside of work. That evening, my phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice sounded panicked, which was unusual. She never panicked. She said, "Your father is sick. Really sick. We need help." I asked what was wrong. She explained that he had been having chest pains for weeks and finally collapsed at home. They took him to the emergency room, but they didn't have insurance. The hospital was talking about thousands of dollars in bills. She said, "Do you know anybody important? Anybody who could help us?" I almost laughed. She had no idea she was calling the director of the very hospital where my father was being treated. I asked her which hospital they were at. She said the name, and I confirmed it quietly. I told her I'd see what I could do, then I hung up and sat in my office, staring at the wall. My first instinct was anger. They had thrown me out with nothing. Now they wanted me to save them. But I was a doctor. I had taken an oath, so I pulled up my father's file and authorized his treatment. I didn't tell them it was me. The next day, I reviewed my father's chart in detail. He had a severe blockage in one of his arteries and needed surgery soon. The medical team was waiting for financial approval before proceeding. I signed off on the procedure and instructed the billing department to set up a standard payment plan. I wanted them treated like any other patient, nothing more, nothing less. That afternoon, my brother showed up at the hospital. I was walking through the lobby when I saw him. He was yelling at one of the nurses, demanding to know why his father wasn't getting immediate surgery. The nurse stayed calm and explained the process, but Marcus wasn't listening. He shouted, "Do you know who we are? We deserve better than this." I stopped in my tracks. He still hadn't recognized me. I stood there in my white coat with my hospital ID clipped to my chest, and he looked right through me. Another nurse whispered something to him, and he turned to leave. I asked security to send me the waiting room footage from that day. That night, I sat in my office and watched the security footage. My mother and brother were sitting in the waiting area, talking to each other. I turned up the volume. My brother said, "I can't believe we're stuck here. If he had actually made something of himself, maybe he could help us." My mother nodded and said, "He's probably still cleaning floors somewhere." What a waste. I paused the video and leaned back in my chair. Even after all these years, their words still cut deep. A nurse knocked on my door and asked if I wanted them removed from the hospital for their behavior. I thought about it. Part of me wanted to say yes. But I shook my head. I said, "Treat them like everyone else. No special favors, no exceptions." She nodded and left. I sat there alone, staring at the frozen image of my family on the screen. They had no idea who I had become. And I wasn't sure I wanted them to know. 2 days later, my father's surgery was scheduled. The surgical team briefed me on the risks and the procedure. I stood in the observation room, watching through the glass as they prepped him. My hands were steady, but my mind was racing. This was the man who told me I was aiming too high. The man who chose my brother over me. And now his life was in the hands of a team I had hired. The surgery took 4 hours. Halfway through, his heart stopped, the monitors flatlined, and the room erupted into controlled chaos. The surgeon began chest compressions while another doctor prepared the defibrillator. I watched, feeling strangely detached. After 2 shocks, his heart started again. I exhaled slowly. When the surgery was finished, the lead surgeon came to my office to update me. He said the procedure went well, but recovery would be long and expensive. I thanked him and asked him to keep me informed. Then I sat alone in my office and cried. For the first time in years, my father survived, but the bills started piling up quickly. Physical therapy, medications, follow-up appointments, it all added up. My mother called the hospital repeatedly, demanding to speak with someone in leadership. She wanted the costs reduced or waived entirely. The staff tried to explain the process, but she wouldn't listen. Finally, the billing manager scheduled a meeting with the director to discuss payment options. That director was me. I sat in my office the day of the meeting, reviewing their file one last time. My father's treatment had cost over $70,000 so far. I knew they couldn't afford it. Part of me wanted to walk in there and tear up the bill. But another part of me remembered the night they put my suitcase on the porch. At exactly 2 o'clock, there was a knock on my door. I said, "Come in." The door opened, and my mother walked in first, followed by Marcus. They both froze when they saw me. My mother's face went completely pale. Marcus just stared, his mouth hanging open. For a long moment, no one said anything. Then my mother whispered, "What are you doing here?" I gestured to the chair across from my desk and said, "Sit down." She sat slowly, her eyes never leaving my face. Marcus stayed standing. His arms crossed, I leaned forward and said, "I'm the director of this hospital. I've been overseeing Dad's care since he arrived." My mother's hand started shaking. She said, You're the director?" I nodded. Marcus laughed bitterly and said, "This is insane, you're a janitor." I looked at him and said, "I was a janitor 15 years ago. Then I went to college, medical school, and worked my way up. You'd know that if you had ever bothered to ask." My mother started crying. She said, "We didn't know, we had no idea." I said, "Would it have mattered if you did?" She didn't answer. I opened the file on my desk and showed them the total cost of my father's treatment. Marcus's face went red. He said, "You expect us to pay this? Your family, you should be helping us." I closed the file and looked at him. I said, "I did help you,